Three, two, one, punch it.
Could you jump to light speed in that tin can? Go back in time in a DeLorean? Will it crash or take to the sky? Tell me, smart guy, does it fly?
Welcome to Does It Fly, the podcast that puts your favorite sci-fi properties, inventions, and conceits to the test. I'm your mad scientist, Hakeem Oluseyi.
And I'm your pop culture expert, Tamara Krinsky. Time to dive into today's topic and see, does it fly?
Welcome back to Does It Fly, Tamara.
Hello, Hakeem. How are you?
Hey, I am amazing. Listen, I know we talk about science fiction movies on this and TV shows and other places where science fiction occurs. I saw a movie with no science fiction on a long airplane ride this weekend, and it was the first time I've been impressed by a movie in a long time.
Wow. Okay. That means you need to watch more movies because there's a lot of really good ones out there.
Oh,
And B, what movie was it?
American Fiction.
Oh, it's so good.
You saw it?
Yeah.
No way. Yeah, I had no idea what I was getting into.
Uh-huh.
I loved it. I was just transfixed there in my seat. You know, the music. It was a throwback for me, right? And the writing, the act, I just love so much about it. But what are we talking about today?
Today?
let me get back on track here.
All right. I know
All
the actors in American Fiction are so good. It's hard to not get distracted by it.
Right.
Right. And it won an Oscar. So there you go.
Oh, it did?
Yeah, it won an Oscar.
Oh.
There it had numerous nominations.
Oh.
And yeah.
It should have won all of them. I thought it was a 2024 new movie.
No, it came out end of 2023, so it was part of the 2023 crop. So yeah, I actually did a bunch of coverage of it for during award season stuff. So yeah,
because you had to watch all those, right? The nominees.
Yeah. I mean, had to makes it sound like work, which I guess technically it is, but like it's part of the fun part of work. Just like this is part of the fun part of work when we get to watch stuff like the topic of today's show. We are talking about the Netflix TV series 3 Body Problem.
Yeah, and you know what? Everyone with a physics degree hears about the 3 body problem, right? And how it's a difficult problem. It's untenable, it's chaotic. And now they've taken that idea and turned it into, let's use that to kill a civilization.
All right, hold on. Let's rewind and go back a tiny bit. All right, so 3 Body Problem, it is based on a book by a Chinese author. And I apologize. I have looked up numerous ways to say this. I'm not as familiar with the pronunciation. It's Liu Shixin. It is a trilogy, actually. The books are trilogy. It's 3 books. And then the series is based on that. And the first series has 8 episodes. And define what a 3 body problem is. Because I didn't know. When I first heard the title, I was like, is this like a physical body thing? Is it? So what's the 3 body problem?
Okay, so the 3 body problem is when you have a gravitational system that involves 3 bodies, 3 objects, say 3 stars, 3 planets. And we see that, right? We see that our solar system has 8 big planets. We see that Mars and Jupiter have their own systems, which are all more than 3. So what's so difficult about 3? Well, it's a special 3. You can have, for example,
okay, wait, I'm going to stop you for a sec. We're not talking about that today.
We ain't?
No,
we got to talk about the 3 body problem.
We're talking about the headset.
Oh, that? You're talking about the headset?
We're talking about headsets today.
Oh my God.
We're going to say, okay, so here's the thing for anyone listening. It's hard for Hakeem not to talk about astrophysics because that's what he does. But
yeah, hello.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to say physics. But look, I just want people to know that there is a real 3 body problem, even though it looks like there isn't. Right? Because there are situations where you can have 3 bodies orbiting in mutual orbits where it doesn't throw everything off.
See, that's what I wanted. I wanted the simple explanation. So it's 3 bodies in orbit.
Wrong guy. I give a simple, long explanation that goes down many tangents. Not a simple, straightforward, short answer. You're looking for someone who's good at this.
I am looking for someone who's good at this. Okay, but here's the thing. Okay. This show is like a science fiction lover's dream because it's chock full of science. So this is the kind of show that we could actually do multiple episodes on, right?
Yes. Yeah, the technologies, the science, the
Mhm.
engineering. There's, as I watch the series, I'm thinking like, man, I'd love to do a discussion about that. Oh, and I'd love to do a discussion about that or an
Right, like,
episode,
we've got
right?
nanotechnology, we've got particle
Yeah.
accelerators, we've
Mm.
got, like, lights and retinas happening.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's so much. The heads up display, the biology that's
Mhm,
involved, the multiple dimensions of the
mhm.
proton unfolding. Oh, this thing right here, man. This
Oh,
is
yeah.
juicy. This
So
is
I'm
juicy.
guessing we're gonna come back to this, and I'm
We
guessing we
have
might
to.
even come back to, like, the complexities of the
Yeah,
astrophysics of all of it. But
that's right. That's right.
today, we're gonna talk about specifically about the VR headset that's featured
The
in it, that
VR
piece of
headset.
technology,
Yeah.
right?
That's right. That's what we're going to talk about. And that piece of technology falls under the general category of a somewhat mature now,
Mhm.
but definitely super active field of research and development called neurotechnology, right? So these are brain human interfaces that
Mhm.
occur in numerous ways. And right now, they're being used mostly for good, not planetary invasion.
Okay,
So,
wait, real quick before you get into it, because I want you to get, like, this is where I want, like, the tentacles. That sounded weird. Anyway.
I heard that too. Yeah.
Yeah. What I do
Yeah.
wanna say is like, we always remind people that we're gonna get into the details of a show or a film that we're talking about, so there will be a lot of spoilers. But I feel like with this show especially, there is so much surprise, there's so many layers to the storytelling. This is one where, like, you definitely, if you've not watched it yet and you don't want it spoiled, press pause, go watch it. There's 8 amazing episodes, then come back and continue the conversation with Hakeem and myself.
Yes, and this is very important for Tamara's part. You might be able to sit here with my part because my part, the first part of every episode, we talk about the technology, the feasibility of it. Could it happen today? Could it happen tomorrow? And I will deliver a verdict on does it fly? Will it ever come into existence? Is it even possible to come into existence? And what is our technical readiness level as a human species, planetary civilization? And then we turn it over to Tamara, who spoils it by,
I'm the spoiler. I'm the spoiler. But, I'll be looking at it from the story what if angle, right? Like, we have this idea. Our creators take us on, toss a what if out to us and invite us on the journey. So once they do that, do they stick to the rules of their world when it comes to the particular device or conceit that we're talking about? Does it make sense? Does the way that it works help to heighten the drama? Does it work for the characters? So that's our second part. And then we'll have a final question of, does it fly for the feels?
does it fly for the fields? Does it deliver the vibes? Is it, and there's multiple layers to those fields, right?
Mhm.
There when you talk about technology, and there's often a discussion about the interface between things like science and faith, right? And oftentimes the conversation goes to origins, right? Evolution, origin of humans, Big Bang, evolution of the universe. But there's that other interface, and that other interface has to do with ethics, right? Do you really want this technology to exist in your world? So we've confronted that now with smartphones, right? There are ethics with the software and the apps. There were ethics that we had to deal with nuclear technology, and now back in our country, reproductive science is there was a thing with in vitro fertilization and recently in one state. So yeah, so we can look at it from multiple angles of the feels and the vibes.
For sure. But before we get to that, we got to know how it works. So, Hakeem, does a VR headset that can basically hack your brain, which is what is featured very strongly in this show, does it fly? Tell me the
You
latest
know
science
what?
on me.
All right, lay the science on you. Talk nerdy to me. All right, so here's the thing. I often form a sort of like feeling just from looking at the topic.
Mhm.
Right, I've seen the show. Like, oh heck no! Oh, of course, right? Somewhere it'll land somewhere in between that spectrum. Heck no,
Mhm.
and of course, right? But
Those
then
are
I
good.
go and I actually study
Yeah.
and I actually read and I
Mhm.
learn, and that's really another really fun part of this show because I learned so much about new technologies. And this one is one that I thought, oh, there is no way, right? But once I started diving into it, I was surprised.
Really? Okay, so what did
Yes,
you
by
find
what
that
I found.
surprised you?
Yeah. So, well, one thing I found that was surprising is how mature the field is. So let's get into it. When you talk about what this headset does, the wearer goes into a simulated reality where they can feel, smell, touch, taste. They feel like they're actually in this other reality. But there are times when it gets too much for them and they just snatch the headset off. So they still have an awareness of their real being. It's not like they go into this other world and they're, they're able to escape and they're able to be completely embodied in this other, virtual world. So, can that work? So, here's the first question I ask myself. Before I get to the technology, I ask myself, can the brain even do something like that? So, we experience our reality, which, science tells us, okay, clearly your sensor system is not designed to detect all of the data that's possible, right? There are smells that we can't smell, other animals can. There's wavelengths of light we can't detect, other animals can, right? Some
Right.
insects on the blue end, pit vipers on the red end. Um, but we're the apex of evolution, right? But
Right.
so I've heard one person say, or one scientist say that, reality is really a hallucination, and the actual reality is our shared hallucination. But
Hmm.
I can go something much more familiar than all of that, right? And that's dreams. We experience dreams and they can be as exhilarating, as frightening as real life. You think you're really there. So to me, the answer to can the brain all on its own without the actual sensory input make us feel like we're awake and conscious and experiencing sensory input?
Oh, yeah, I had a nightmare the other night where it was very creepy, and I won't get into the details, but, like, I it was one of those dreams where you're trying to scream, and you can feel
Oh,
yourself not being able to scream, but in
yeah,
the
I hate
dream,
those.
I can remember now the feeling I had in the dream of, like,
Yeah,
the scream being caught in my throat, and
yeah.
I could hear the whisper that came out, and the thought in my head that I wanted it to come out loud and scream for help, and I couldn't. Like, all of
Oh,
that sensory stuff, I can feel it right now sitting here, but it was a dream.
right. It was a dream. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Now there was one time that the dream does become reality. If you feel like you have to urinate while you're in your dream, stop the dream.
Good to know. Good to know.
Do not continue that dream. Yeah. So when you look at now the whole neurotechnology of interfacing with the brain,
Mhm.
the questions become how do you do it? How can you do it? And what is being done? All right. So there's two main parts. One part is sensing what's happening in the brain.
Mhm.
And when we say the brain, we're talking about collections of biological cells that are living, and neurons are the basic ones that we want to monitor. But there's other ways to monitor action in the brain. So when we get to neurons, the thing about neurons is their internal communications are done using electricity. And so those can be measured externally by various means, amplified and read out. Okay.
Okay.
But here's the thing, there is a trade-off with how you interface with the brain. So that's a whole other science, right? Machine brain interface, computer
Mhm.
brain interface.
You're talking about,
So,
like, Neuralink and stuff like that?
like Neuralink, yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah. And there's other technologies. And so the problems are you can be very specific and trigger specific parts of the brains and specific neurons using nanowires, microwires, these implanted circuits into the brain. But there's two big problems. It's almost impossible to get a large coverage of all the brain matter doing that, right? It's very specific. But also, your body's going to have an immune response. And there's going to be degradation of the cellular biology by these implants. So, the better way to go, ideally, which is what this headset does in the show, is a wireless form where there is no implant. But here's the problem with that, right? You can do this wirelessly, right? They have these there's basically three ways in which they interface with the brain. Magnetic fields, light, there's magnetic resonance imaging, right? The thing here is the wireless ones are all like large area, large volume, but they don't have the same resolution and specificity as the implants, right? So that's where we exist right now, right? We exist in a place where you can modulate brain activity. And this is really good for people who are, say, paraplegics, where they have a system that goes on their mounted on their skull. And by thinking, right? So what they're doing is they're reading. So the infrared method, what it does is it's so interesting because there's a wavelength from, I think, around 650 nanometers to about 1300 nanometers, where the skin and the body and the bones are transparent to the light, right? This is infrared light, but hemoglobin absorbs it. All
That
right.
is so cool.
That is so cool,
That's
right? And so
really
there's a
cool.
difference between how oxygenated hemoglobin does it and how unoxygenated hemoglobin absorbs it. So they put these sensors on your head in pairs, right? One sends out the infrared radiation, the other detects it. And you can actually see where blood is going in the brain, because if those neurons, that part of the brain is working, they're stressed, they need to be fed oxygen and more blood, you can now see that this part of the brain is activated, right? And so in a
Nice.
way, you have the ability to read thoughts. So
That's
this is
super
technology
cool.
that exists. Yeah.
Okay, so we're like on our way there, kind of.
We're like on our way there, right? But here's the thing again. This particular helmet does it wirelessly. And then there's the other thing that has to do with how far in the brain you can sense, right? It's not equal from the surface to the core. It's not, there are attenuation and absorption issues that get in the way, right? So you can, if you're going to give people these high resolution, um, experiences,
Full sensory experiences.
full sensory experiences, then that sounds like it has to be very targeted, right? You need to
Yeah.
really be able to stimulate exactly the cells and regions of the brain that you want to and need to. And to be able to do that wirelessly,
That seems like a big ask, a big
that
jump.
that is a big jump.
Because
That
we're
really,
still, I
really is a
mean,
big jump.
we're still figuring out, well, I mean, neuroscience has come a long way, but we're still figuring out which parts of the brain do what, right?
Right. But here's another caveat. There are these, instead of planting implants, there are injectables, right? That can go in, nanobots, micro robots that could go in, go to the part of the brain that you want them to be in. So they'll behave like an implant, but you're much smaller than a cell now, right? So you're not really, you're like a viral particle, right? You're not making a big suite of damage in the brain necessarily. But yet you can go to the sites where you need to provide some sort of stimulation, whether it's a forcing neurons to fire, right? And then even then you can bring in a chemical aspect, right? Because the way that the neurons communicate between each other is chemical. So perhaps you can go into those areas, the synapse, and it's like an SSRI.
What?
you know, it's like MDMA
We're
and an
still with that.
SSRI do this, achieve the same outcome of more serotonin in the brain,
Mhm.
but by a different method, right? One makes the cell that release serotonin release, and the other makes the cell that takes up serotonin take it up more slowly. It inhibits
Right.
that take up, right? So you have a greater baseline of serotonin in the brain. So you're happier. Ta-da! So, when you look at how you're going to stimulate cells to get them to
Mhm.
fire the way you want them to fire, you could do it, is what I'm saying, probably once you're super advanced and super high resolution, from the triggering from the voltage state or from the chemical side.
Well, it's interesting because hearing you talk about that piece of it also makes me think about, right? So far we've been talking about the fact that this is a multi-sensory VR interface. You can hear, smell, taste, touch, and all of that. But like hearing you talk about things that evoke different kinds of emotions and put you into different emotional states, like that's perhaps another way into it that I hadn't been thinking about with this particular VR headset. Like, because we watch these characters go into different worlds and have very, very heightened emotions. And I've been thinking about it purely from the sensory perspective, and then you react to the senses. But it's also possible that like there's a dual mechanism at work where they're affecting your emotional makeup as well and how you're reacting to that.
Yeah, how you know what? I can imagine that you can do far more manipulation than they even show because they're
Mhm,
not showing memory manipulation. Because if you
mhm.
could do experiential manipulation, you could do memory manipulation. So what you're talking about, you could go into a state of depression, right? I mean, how many, several of the characters get their head chopped off multiple times by entering uninvited, right?
This
So
is true, this is and of course, like, now my brain goes to, like, movies like Total Recall, which
yeah.
I would love to actually do an episode on at some time and take, like, a deep dive into memory manipulation.
You're not the eyeballs exploding part. That's not.
You know? It's
So back to the headset. Yeah. So, this one is a really, 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 really tough one because
yeah,
is it possible today? The answer is definitely no, right? But does it
right,
fly is not based on just is it available today?
right.
Can this technology actually exist? And, there's a saying that we have. So I used to develop astronomical cameras. Getting the first pixel
Mhm.
is way harder than going from, say, 10 megapixels to 20 megapixels, right?
Okay.
So it seems like we've crossed that first pixel threshold where it comes
Mm,
to neurotechnology. We are reading the brain. We are stimulating the brain. We are helping people medically and people are getting therapy from these techniques. So it's something that really is happening. They're not yet, as far as I know, inducing dream states, but I could clearly see some military operation thinking, "Oh, how can we manipulate minds from afar?" Right? Set down all your weapons and walk out of your trenches, right? Let's settle this the peaceful way. Brain manipulation. So, Professor Xavier,
neural warfare.
neural warfare. Oh, you just invented something. I cannot, so as I look at this and I think about could it happen eventually? Can we get to that specificity?
Mhm.
And what I think of is going to throw you off because most people think something else. But I immediately think of this piece of technology called a squid. So squids are these amplifiers for these incredibly sensitive detectors. Like that, these detectors can detect like a single photon of very low energy. And that's what they're using for like cosmic microwave background radiation experiments nowadays, right? These squid amplifiers connected to a detector. So when you started off looking at analog and digital electronics and what signals, were amplifiable and this sort of thing. There are certain thresholds you couldn't see getting beyond. The same thing is with memory, right? Computer memory. We had 1.44 megabyte floppy disk this big, and now to go to thumb drives that are like a terabyte or these tiny little disks that are over a terabyte, several terabytes, it seemed unlikely, but it's a scaling problem, right? It's a problem of scaling. Can you scale? And so looking at what we're doing now, it seems to me I don't see a fundamental limit on how far we can scale because the size of cells compared to the
Mhm.
size of our technology, the cells are very big compared to the size of a nanobot, for example, right? So uh, it seems like it could happen. It really does seem like it could happen. I can imagine a world where this sort of technology is possible. The thing that they don't say is that there's some sort of, once you put it on and you look at it, it sends a stream of nanobytes through your pupil, right? It don't say anything like that. But if there were implants in the brain that could give you the specificity, and then the headset provides fields that do the manipulation and reading, based on those nanobots, they can both stimulate and read, is what I would imagine. And somehow whatever the resolution of the head, because there is a thing called data compression, right? So if I have a image, I don't have to give you every pixel of data. I can apply an algorithm to it in order to compress the data, so I can give you something lower resolution, and then you uncompress it and get the high resolution thing back. So there's also something along those lines, right?
It's very intriguing to hear that, like, you are saying an absolute yes to the scientific possibility of this in the future.
Yeah, I'm saying a yes. I'm saying a yes. Those researchers are hella researching out there. They're making it happen. They're making it happen. Yeah. I'm
Yeah.
impressed. Yeah. I don't know if you heard this growing up, but I would always hear the pace at which scientific advancement is occurring
Mhm.
is accelerating.
Yeah.
So I was hearing this in the 80s and the 90s. And when I became a graduate student, when I sort of got in touch with what the current state of technology is, I'm like, there's no way this can continue but yet here we are.
Well, so
Right?
okay, so that brings up that actually connects to a really interesting thing, in a slight difference between the book and the TV series, right? So like we on this podcast, we really focus on the shows, on the movies, even though a lot of the properties that we talk about do originate in books. But I do think something that's worth talking about here is that in the original book, it was the video game itself that they played once the headset and the suit were on that was the piece of alien technology. But the interface was much more, sort of we're kind of where we are now. It was, kind of a clunkier headset, and it was a haptic suit. As opposed yeah. So that
Wait,
almost like
in this one?
in the book that it's based on, yeah,
Oh,
in the
okay, because Ready
original.
Player One had the haptic set too.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
Haptic
like,
suit too.
if you're familiar with Ready Player One, something that's very similar to that kind of interface. And so when you think about the fact that, this book goes back and where was technology when it was originally being written, that makes sense. But that said, so in the TV show, they made the very specific decision that it was the actual headset itself that was the piece of alien technology. And that was a strategic decision, because it allows for a couple of things. It is kind of our entree into this story. We have this incredible group of characters. They're called the Oxford Five, and they are five students who went to school together. They've sort of all dispersed. They're all doing different things right now. When it comes to the headset, we really focus on three of them. We focused on Jin, who is a physicist, a particle physicist. We focus on Jack, who is actually dropped out and founded a company called Jack Snacks. And he's like a gazillionaire. He's got like the third highest, most popular brand of chips or crisps, as they call them in the UK. And he often will follow Jin's leading things. And then you've got Augie, who left the world of physics to go into applied science, and her field is nanotechnology. And she actually is very anti trying this headset. So,
Yeah.
so the fact that like they have this very intriguing object is a great way to start off the show because it pulls you as the viewer in. And one of the things that I think is done so well is the melding of genres in this
Mhm.
particular show, right? Like it's
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
very awesome science heavy sci-fi, and that pulls straight from the books, which have so much science in them, as we talked about, but also makes it really complex to adapt. But it's also got thriller elements, it has political drama elements, it's got relationshipy stuff. And that's a lot to pull together. So you got to give credit to the creative team behind this, which is David Benioff, DB Weiss or Dan Weiss, and Alexander Wu. If the first two names sound familiar, that's because they're the team behind Game of Thrones, who I would say had a little bit of experience in pulling together really
Yeah.
intense shows out of complex literary material.
Here's a question. Here's a
Yeah.
question for you because you talk about how this show grabs you in
Mhm.
that way, and that was definitely my experience.
Yeah.
But here's my question for you: do you double and triple screen, or do you focus all on one screen
It honestly depends on the show. And I
when
have
you
to
watch this one? Because I do double triple screen all the time.
this show actually made me put down my other screens.
Yeah,
And
yeah, I
in
did too.
yeah,
Yeah,
in part that's because I found it really compelling. In part
right.
that's because there's, a chunk of it that you need to read subtitles for, and I'm really good at multitasking, but I can't look at one screen and be reading a subtitle on
Look,
another
it
screen.
grabbed me.
And I
Yeah.
think that, like, a big part of that is because they do ground it in the relationships of these 5 characters. Like, we've talked about the idea that often you'll have common structures for shows are that you'll have an ordinary group of people thrust into extraordinary situations, or you'll have a group of extraordinary people, superheroes, let's say, who are dealing with everyday life. And that's what creates your tension. It ratchets up the drama, it creates your conflict. Well, this one, I mean, these folks are all incredibly smart, so I wouldn't call them ordinary, but essentially, you've got your ordinary group of people who are thrust into this extraordinary situation, and that, I think, helps bring you into it.
So that whole thing you said about melding genres, right?
Mhm.
There's something about this show where I wouldn't be surprised if an airbender popped out I wouldn't be surprised if somebody popped out swinging a lightsaber. You know, there's something about this show where it almost feels like so many other kind of shows could seamlessly like fall
Well
into it.
well,
Yeah.
that's what the VR piece of it does, right? Because, like, so
Yeah.
as these characters go and visit these different worlds, so basically, okay, so let me go backwards for a second. So what we watch Jin and Jack do is we watch them progress through different levels of the game, which are accessed through this headset. And each level, they learn something different. I'm not gonna get into the specifics of what they learn to, like, not completely spoil it for everybody. But what's
Right.
also cool for the viewer, tell me if you felt like this. Like, I felt like the way that there's something new that we learn in every episode, I mean, many new things, it almost felt like I was experiencing gameplay as a viewer. As I progressed
Oh
through
yeah.
each level, each episode of the show,
Yeah.
I was, doing that kind of a thing.
Yeah, I felt that way. And I also felt like I was progressing through different levels of the show
Mhm.
because it's when you get into the seat and you get into the episodes, it's like, okay, where'd the headset go? You know, it's almost like you're in
Uh-huh.
another story that's interesting and it transitions between these. It's all one story, but yet it feels like I'm transitioning between different stories, but not in that way that shows typically do that, right? There's, it's
Mhm.
not like Pulp Fiction, right? You have the VR pieces of it, you have
Yes.
the Earth calling all
Mhm.
mighty superheroes. You have the dramas around, how we respond to what's happening. Then you have the cult or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
The opening. Think about the opening scene and what you think you're going to see,
Uh-huh.
and that's not what you actually end up seeing. And so this whole, for me, again, I say this every episode, but when it comes to writing, if I'm not predicting what's going to happen next, I'm loving it.
Yeah, and that
Yeah,
definitely applies here, and I think that
yeah,
part of the reason that it holds together is because they're generally very good about keeping the grounded parts grounded and sticking to the rules that they've set up, right? So, we talked about the relationships between the characters, but then also let's talk about the rules for the headset, okay? So, you have to be invited to use it. If you are not invited to use it, you put it on, you get
and it was refreshing to me too that when that happened in the game,
Mhm.
the wearer's head didn't just fall off. Because that's the thing that happens in a lot of these is that they get poked in there and they bleed in real life, but this doesn't do that.
No, 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 it stays the decapitation stays in the game.
As it should.
Sounds like the title of a book, Decapitation Stays in the Game. One of the other rules is wait, what was I gonna say? Oh, I know what it was, you have to pick a player name,
Yes.
right? Which is
Yes.
a super fun part of this, and there's
It
so many,
is.
like I have to say,
Yeah.
you must have just been tickled by this, Hakeem, because there's so
Oh,
many Easter
absolutely.
eggs in the names of the like, so
Yeah.
Jin picks
Copernicus.
who,
Right.
of course, we know was a heretic for daring to suggest that the entire universe did not revolve around the Earth, but the Earth
Right.
actually revolved around the sun, which I think
Yeah.
is a great metaphor for humanity, which is discovering that the Earth is
Mm,
not figuratively the center of the universe. There are other
mm.
folks out there, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um,
Allegedly, allegedly.
in the show.
I know what you meant. I know what you meant. Yeah, yeah,
We've
yeah.
already mentioned aliens. It's okay.
Yeah, yeah.
So
So, question for you. Do you have a favorite scientist?
do I have? Yeah, Rosalind Franklin. Rosalind
Oh,
Franklin
oh,
is the
her.
one
Her
who
name's
was
Rosalind
left out.
Franklin.
I love her
Yeah,
story.
I know her.
She's the one who is left out of
Yeah,
the, Nobel for the discovery of the structure of DNA.
yeah,
Basically, she was a contemporary of Crick and Watson, and there are
yeah,
many stories as to, why things went down the way they did. But long story
yeah, yeah.
short, she took what is known as photograph 51, which was instrumental in cracking
Right.
the structure. And, there's a bunch of great books on her.
I
She
saw a
luckily
documentary. Yeah,
yeah, luckily she's been pretty much vindicated and her
right.
her place has essentially been restored in the history, but I love her. I'm just
Well, look,
like, I wanna make a movie about her. I
if you
want like
want some overlooked women, oh boy, does astronomy have some for you. They, they,
that's yeah.
they're, but people are they're getting their recognition now, right?
Mhm.
But there are these stories of, oh yeah, Henrietta Leavitt, discovered this like super useful thing that we must use, and in
Yeah.
fact, Hubble used it to discover that our galaxy isn't the only one, but she wasn't allowed to be an astronomer because she was a woman, right?
Right. Yes. But we had the famed Harvard computers who, were
Right.
doing all
Yeah.
of the calculations
Yeah.
and things
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's
Yeah.
actually women
Yeah.
in science is a particular pet area of mine.
So I would tell you uh, one of mine who's little known in the Western world. But I love him because he talked mad trash. You know where I'm from.
Mhm.
We talk mad trash. It's a sport. So this guy's name is Ibn al Haytham,
Uh-huh.
and he was a turn of the century, 1021 of the Common Era, what people would normally call AD. He wrote the first scientific treatise called the Book of Optics. So he's the guy who figured out how the eye works. But he was very he was Copernicus before Copernicus, but not in the sense of figuring out the real layout of the solar system like
Uh-huh.
Copernicus did. But
Yeah.
basically, the model that everybody was using that was from this dude Ptolemy, he was like, nah, that ain't it. And so he wrote a whole book called Apropos on Considering Ptolemy or something like that.
Okay.
But he says, for a man to imagine an arrangement in the heavens in his head does not make it so.
I
An
love
arrangement that is
that.
impossible. For him to imagine an arrangement that is impossible in his head does not make it so. You gotta observe, because he's the guy who came up with, we only accept as true scientifically what we actually observe to be true, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
But then along comes Galileo, and he's like, well, actually, to get to the deepest insights, you can't determine experimentally. There's no experiment you can do, but you have to do them only in your head. Like in Galileo's case, imagine there
Mhm.
was no friction, right? You couldn't set that up
Mhm.
in the lab, but you could set that up in your
Yeah.
head. And that's when he realized that, an object at rest or in motion remains at rest or in motion unless acted upon by an outside force, which became Newton's first law, right? It was because of that mental experiment that you could never do in real life.
Mhm.
So anyway, that was another. See how I told you I go off on tangents,
No, I love
Tamara.
your tangents. I love
Yeah.
your tangents. So the reason I stopped your tangent earlier was so that we didn't ruin another episode on doing the science of a three-body problem, which I kind of want to do because there's so much in this show to talk about. But wait, I do have to. So I love my quotes, right? So
Oh
I do
yeah.
have to read because we're talking about underrepresented scientists. I do have to
Yeah.
read one thing from one of the actors, or actually no, it's from a scientist. So in an article about this show, they interviewed an astrophysicist named Dr. Becky Smethurst. I hope I'm saying that right. So often, women are depicted as either ponytail, glasses, big boobs, male gaze kind of thing, or they haven't run a hairbrush through their hair, no makeup on, sloppily dressed. All they care about is science and nothing else. And
Mm,
nothing in between. So it was a breath of
mm,
fresh air for Smethurst to watch as two women scientists just sat in a bar chatting about physics, and they're just normal people. And I loved
wow.
hearing that. That makes me
Me
so
too.
happy.
But there's something misleading, like physicists, just normal people. Dr. Becky, I don't know. Have you watched your show, Dr. Becky? We're
I'll
all go
I'll
ahead.
leave that trash talk between you and Dr. Becky. I'm not going to
Look,
insert
I'm
my words
talking to
there.
all the physicists. The physicists are listen, I hate hippies, nerds, and weirdos. Those are my people. And let me tell you, the physicists are a weird group of humans.
I love that you've talked about how biologists are nasty, physicists
Nasty.
are weird.
Weird.
Is there any group of scientists that you love?
Water polo players.
Wait,
I
how
don't know
are
what science they do, but
I
I
was
got to
about to
hang out.
say, how are water polo player scientists?
I am duly listen. There are two species that I'm incredibly impressed by: water polo players and horses.
Okay, you and William Shatner. So I recently did a Q&A with him after an event
Yeah.
because there's a documentary that's out that's all about his life. And a big
Mm.
chunk of it is about his love for animals and
Oh.
horses. And
Oh
yeah, so
wow.
you guys
Yeah.
you guys should chat about that if you ever come in
Oh man.
contact
Yeah. A
with him.
couple of years ago, I rode a horse through very rough territory in the mountains of Montana, and I'm
Uh-huh.
like, dude, this machine is far better than any off-road vehicle. And it has its own brain. I can take a nap. Like,
Right. All right. So when it comes to does this VR headset fly as far as the story goes, I'm going to say yes. I mean, we've already talked about the fact that, it's the characters, which are the way into these worlds, really
Yeah.
ground you. There's a set of
Yeah.
consistent rules that they generally
Mhm.
follow. I will also say one of the things that I think works in its favor is the vagueness of how it works. Like, we
Yeah.
really don't know. Like, we know at a certain point they mention that there's a
Retinal scanner, an oxygen meter, and a brainwave sensor.
so we know those things are part of it, but we don't know a lot of other details. And I think may for other shows, maybe that would be annoying, like we'd want to know more. But what I think works for this is factors into the whole thriller element and that sort of joy that, at least for me, like the visceral joy I got as each episode I discovered a little bit more and a little bit of that story onion was unpeeled and each layer. So I got to learn. So I actually think it brings you into this. Like, it increases the suspense element, which for me is part of the fun of the show. And and that I think also mirrors like the gaming experience, which is, as you progress through levels. So like
Right.
there's that piece of it which feels very true to what they're presenting.
Yes.
I would also say that there is well, two things. It acts as a catalyst for character. So, like, we know that one of the things that you learn at the beginning, this isn't giving too much away because it's in the very first episode, is that there are a bunch of scientists, famous scientists, who seem to have tried this headset and either have been killed or committed suicide. We're not really sure at the beginning. And that puts out this idea that it could be dangerous. So a great
Right.
character development piece is
Yeah.
how do our Oxford 5 and the other characters that we meet, and I would be remiss if I did not mention Benedict Wong, who plays
Mm.
our investigator. He plays a character named
Oh,
Clarence.
man.
You maybe if that name sounds familiar, he's in the Doctor Strange movies.
Yes. Love
He
that guy.
plays Wong. He starts as a
Yeah.
librarian and ultimately becomes Sorcerer
Yeah.
Supreme. So I've interviewed him a bunch of times, and I
Oh, you
adore,
have?
yeah, for Marvel
Yeah.
stuff, and I
Yeah.
adore him. So anyway, the way that different characters react to it reveals something
Mm.
about them, right? Like you've
Right.
got
Right.
Jin, our particle physicist, who becomes
Yeah.
obsessed with it and
Yeah.
figuring out the game. And
Yes.
then, you've got Augie, who's way more like, what is happening with that? And is
Right.
very
Right.
distrustful
Right.
of it because of
Yeah.
some of the other
Yeah.
things. And then you've
Yeah.
got Jack,
I'd be
who's got,
Augie.
yeah. I
Yeah.
was gonna ask you that. Like, if it arrived,
Right.
if the box arrived on your doorstep, would you try it on?
Heck no. I mean, you listen, boxes do arrive at my doorstep, and I'm like, I'm not expecting this box.
Mhm.
So what is going on here, right? And
Right.
I track down the source of a box
Yeah.
before it gets too much touching. And
Mhm.
so you think I'm going to put something on my face? No, it's not happening. I'm sorry.
And like,
So
I have that.
I've received too much safety and anti-espionage training in my career. Like, no, I'm not clicking that.
And see,
I'm
I
not
have that
opening
same
your document.
reaction to unknown beauty products that arrive on my doorstep where it's like, I'm not putting that on my face. I
They
don't know
do
what's in
that?
there.
Oh,
From a story perspective, it flies, but it sounds like we both maybe have some reservations for does it fly vibe-wise? I mean,
yeah.
I would look, there's a part of me that would love to try this thing, and there
Yeah.
are
Yeah.
so, like, speaking of VR headsets for good that can hack your brain, there
Right.
have
Right.
been, cases where VR experience have been used to create empathy. Where you're putting
Interesting.
somebody like there was a whole Guantanamo VR experience where you were suddenly in that environment and you understood on a visceral level what was happening and you come out of that with a very different experience. I've looked at and sort of looking at where science and science fiction cross over and how that can be used. Some of the things I've looked at are nature experiences that can be accessed through VR for people who don't get to experience nature very often, who maybe they've grown up in more urban environments and just don't have access to like jaunt off to, the wild for a while. Like suddenly, if you're experiencing that, you have an appreciation for nature, and that can change your whole outlook on what you think of our planet, on the things you might be willing to do to protect it, on the way that you vote. So the idea that it can engender empathy is a potentially very good use. In fact,
Could
I
be.
was
Yeah.
talking about the show with a friend of mine, so we were talking about VR, and he shared that he had lately been doing some city tours in preparation for a trip that he was doing. So he's been
Mhm.
like using his I think he's got an Oculus, I'm not sure, to like
Oh,
walk
With a
through
VR headset?
yeah. So, like, to walk through the streets of Paris and things like
Oh,
that.
wow.
During one of these, like, sort of almost like sort of immersive Google Street type things, he went back to Florence, which was a city he hadn't been in 20 years, but
Oh,
apparently has
wow.
a lot of nostalgia for because of some of the stuff that happened. And
Wow.
he came out of the session, like, in tears because the
Wow.
visceral element of it
Yeah.
brought him back to that moment in a
Wow.
way that a 2D image or just looking at a picture
Yeah.
couldn't do. So there's
Wow.
great power there, but with that,
Woo.
also
And
you can
remember what we talked about in a previous episode about AI. You can have a talk with Einstein. So now
Mhm.
with a headset like this, man, you can have a round table. All right, King Arthur, Albert, what's your scientist again? The woman with
Rosalind
the
Franklin.
Rosalind.
Yep.
we're we're gonna have a chat today.
Alright, so I guess the question is, when we talk about does it fly for the feels, what's your
Yeah.
answer?
I'm scared of this right now, and I'm thinking that, I don't feel safe with this in the world yet. I can see so many good uses for it. Like, one thing that just bugs me is criminals and the lack of rehabilitation that they receive, right? If we could rehabilitate people, and stop difficult arms, or maybe there was a negotiation mode, wherever nations have big issues. They're like, put these on, and you're gonna come out with an answer that does not involve,
That'd be so
very
interesting
bad
if you
things.
could figure out if you could enact conflict virtually, so you could try out different scenarios so that you could find the one that works, but there would be no actual damage in real life. That's so interesting. I love that idea.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it has such upside, right? But the
Mhm.
downside and the potential for abuse is so freaking great.
So I'm with you.
Yeah,
I'm scared of flying with this. I'm scared to
yeah. Let's
fly with
not
this.
fly with this one.
This totally flies as science fiction, and
Yeah,
you should absolutely everyone watching
right.
definitely should watch this show because as I think you
Oh,
figured
yeah.
out by now, Hakeem and I both love it.
Love it. Love the show. Love the show. It has me fully immersed in a 2D virtual experience.
I just have to say as we wrap up, so we have name dropped a lot of scientists in this episode because we're nerdy that way. And I have to give a shout out to our production team because if you don't
Ooh,
know this, in addition to obviously you're watching this on YouTube or you're listening to it on Spotify or Apple or wherever you get your podcasts, but there is a page for each episode, and our amazing producers will actually like give you links to some of the people that we've talked about or other shows that, maybe kind of reference some of these same ideas. It's an awesome resource. So
yeah.
definitely check out the page and follow us on our socials.
And continue to nerd out and geek out with us. Does it fly? Flies. Join us every Friday. Tamara, Hakeem, we're here in the house.
All right. We'll see you next time and check us out at doesitflypod.com.